Okay, 14.1b. So we've already gone over kind of the order we go in, so I'm just going to show you how to do a full problem here. So the first one we're going to look at is a 2 by 2. The next one is a 3 by 3, which if you haven't done the homework for 14.1a, that 3 by 3 can help you there. So first thing I do is set it up. So -5 and 2 are my x columns, -4 and 1 are my y columns, and then -3 and 0 are on the other side. So the first thing I want to do is to get this guy to be a 1. So I know that I'm going to be dividing by something. And then once I have that, I'm just going to rewrite row 2 because I know it's not changing. And I'm taking a fifth of all of these. So that's a 1. This will be a 4 over 5. Just leave the fraction. And if you have fractions that can reduce, always reduce them if you can. Now that I have the 1 there, I need this to be a 0. So what I'm going to do is say row 2 minus 2 of row 1 is now the new row 2. I'm going to write that on the next line here. So I still have the same row 1, but now I'm going to take row 2, I'm going to minus 2 of row 1, which you'll have some gross fractions, but that's okay. They'll all work out in the end. So 2 minus 2, that first spot is a 0. The next one, 1. So 1 is also 5/5. Minus 8/5 is -3 over 5. And then 0 minus 6/5, it's just that. Now I want to get this to be a 1 again. So I'm going to take 5/3, the opposite. Okay, so that means I times by 5 and divide by -3. So my row 1 isn't changing yet. But my row 2, I'm going to times these all by -5 over 3. You should get 2 there. And then my last step is to get this to be a 0. And to get it to be a 0, remember I minus, so row 1 minus, and I can do that whole thing, 4/5, minus row 2 is our new row 1. And that should give you, let's do that. So minus 4/5 of row 2, minus 4/5 of row 2, minus 4/5 of row 2. So 1 minus 0, that stayed a 1. 4/5 minus 4/5 is a 0. And then 3/5 minus 8/5 is -5/5, or -1. And then row 2 shouldn't change. So my answers here are x equals -1 and y equals 2. Okay, so it keeps you a little bit more organized than doing elimination or substitution. So now we move on to the 3 by 3. This one will take a few more steps just because there's more problems. So I'm going to write my matrix. So that's my x column, 2, -5, -4, and make sure you write small so you have space. My y column is right here. There's no y here, so it's a 0. And there's a 1 right there. Always keep the signs. And then my z column, 4, 4, and -5. And then 2, 7, and 5 on the other side. Now again, first thing, make that a 1. So I'm taking half of row 1. Excuse me. So row 2 didn't change. But you're taking half of row 1. Now this is my new matrix. Now I'm going to make this be a 0. And you could have done this one first also. It doesn't really matter which one goes first. I even sometimes do it in the same step. But for now I'd like to see them as 2 separate steps. So I'll do row 2. I'm going to add 5 to it. I'm going to take row 1 because that's where my 1 was. So this didn't change. And my bottom one, row 3, did not change. But my row 2, what I'm going to do is add 5 of row 1. So plus 5 of row 1, plus 5 of row 1, plus 5 of row 1 plus 5 of row 1. So it should give me 0. 1 plus 0 is 1. 4 plus 10 is 14. 7 plus 5 is 12. So my next one, let's see if I can fit this here. So I want this guy to be a 0. So I'm going to do row 3 plus 4 of row 1. So my row 1 didn't change, and my row 2 didn't change. My row 3, I'm going to add 4 of row 1. So plus 4 of row 1 plus 4 of row 1. Oops, that's a 0 in the row 1. Plus 4 of row 1 plus 4 of row 1. So you always look back to row 1. So for that first one, you get 0. Negative 3 plus 0 is still negative 3. Negative 5 plus 8 is 3. And 5 plus 4 is 9. So now, I'm trying to get, let's see, we have the 1 here. Let me mark them all. So we have the 1, 0, 0. The next column we have the 1 and the 0, so I only need to change this guy. It's going to be making that a 0. So remember, anytime you're trying to get something to be a 0, it's adding or subtracting. So I'm going to add 3 of row 2. So this is row 3 plus 3 of row 2, where that 1 is in the column. So I'm going to copy those over, just because right now only row 3 is changing. So 1, 0, 2, 1. And then 0, 1, 14, 12. In my row 3, I'm going to be adding 3 of row 2. So I'm going to zoom in here. So plus 3 of row 2, plus 3 of row 2, plus 3 of row 2. That's going to be a big number. That's okay. Plus 3 of row 2. So in this case, I get 0 plus 0 is 0. The next number should be 0. Let's see. Negative 3 plus 3 is 0. The next one, 3 plus, and that is a 42, which gets you 45. And then 9 plus 36, which gets you 45 again. Okay, now at this step, oops, forgot to write that. Okay, now we have all the 1s and 0s here and here. Next step is to get a 1 in that last row. So I'm going to divide by 45. So row 1 and 2 aren't changing. Oops. Okay, 0, 1, 14, 12. And now I'm going to divide each of the row 3s by 45. So 0, 0, 1, 1. Worked out nice and pretty. Now I'm going to get this guy to be a 0 by minusing 2. And I'm looking at this row because that's where my 1 is. So I'm going to go in here and minus 2 of row 3, minus 2 of row 3, minus 2 of row 3, minus 2 of row 3. So writing this over, we should get 1, 0, 0, and negative 1. And then looking here, we want to get this to be a 0, so we're going to minus 14. And again, use row 3. So minus 14 of row 3, minus 14 of row 3, minus 14 of row 3, minus 14 of row 3. And that should give us row 1 didn't change. Row 2 is going to change, but row 3 didn't. So 0 minus 0, 1 minus 0, 14 minus 14, 12 minus 14. So our answers here, all the way from the beginning, we wanted x, y, and z. X is negative 1, y is -2, z is 1. And that's your answers.